Hi, I'm Katie Stone. Welcome to Dystopia. This is the seventh in a series of videos designed to open new pathways into dystopianism for those unsure where to begin, or for the hardened dystopians out there to offer an opportunity to return to first principles and try and work out what made you interested in dystopianism in the first place. There are more reading lists, learning resources, and ways to get involved on my website at katiemcgregorstone.co.uk. But for now, wherever you are on your journey with dystopianism, and however much time and energy you have for this today, you are welcome. In this video, I'm going to be talking about reproduction in dystopias, so how reproduction is controlled. And by reproduction, I mean both the literal sexual reproduction of children, but also more broadly the project of reproducing the population, creating a new generation of dystopian citizens. And to do this, I'm going to be focusing on Rose Macaulay's novel What Not. So this is probably the most obscure text of the ones that I've looked at. I didn't know about this until last year when it was on a course that I taught, which was designed by Dr. Raquel Adini. But it's a great novel, it's really funny, and I really recommend it. And it's a very interesting early example of a dystopia that really grapples with reproduction as a central aspect of dystopianism. So briefly, for those who haven't read it, What Not was written in 1918, before the end of the First World War, but it's set after the war has ended. So Macaulay is imagining a world where the war is no longer going on, and she imagines that the old governments have fallen, new governments have appeared in their place, and there's a real emphasis on not having another world war. And to ensure this, the new regime has brought in a new ministry, the Ministry of Brains, whose project is to make people cleverer. There's the idea that we had this world war because people weren't clever enough. If only they were more clever, then maybe there would be fewer wars. And so the novel follows Kitty Fremont alongside a host of other characters who work for the Ministry of Brains, and we see how they roll out the ministry's policies to try and make people more clever, and we see how these policies are received by the British people. So I'll be talking about Macaulay's novel, but unlike the other texts that I've covered, there has been no film or graphic novel adaptation yet. Maybe there will be in future. But for now, what I've decided to use as illustrations for this video are old government propaganda posters, largely from the First World War, some from the Second World War, alongside at the end some more radical protest posters which deal with the issue of reproduction as well. Macaulay was very knowledgeable about government propaganda. She herself worked in the War Office and worked as a journalist. So I think this is a really central theme to the novel, and hopefully will help to complement my discussion of reproduction in this video. As I will be talking about reproduction, just to give you a heads up, there will be discussions of abortion and of sterilization of abuse, as well as other controls of reproduction. I won't really linger on those, but what I will talk about in more detail is how these policies have been targeted at and affected disabled people. And I do quote from some ableist descriptions of disabled people in What Not. I think Macaulay is broadly critical of these depictions, but I think it's important to talk about them head on. So just to give you a heads up on that. Now, the structure of this video will be that I'll first turn back to this central question for these videos, which is, what is a dystopia? So I'll look at that question again through the lens of reproduction. I will then turn to a rundown of different methods of reproductive control that we see in What Not, before giving an example of real-life reproductive controls that have inspired and influenced dystopias, and ending, as usual, on a more utopian note focusing on visions of a world free of reproductive control. Um, so I'll begin, as I always do, with this definition from the Oxford English Dictionary of a dystopia as an imaginary place or condition in which everything is as bad as possible, opposed to utopia. As we can see from all of the corrections and additions I've made, I've had a lot of problems with this definition, but I think it gives us a kind of good basis to move out from. So I've been adding to it and I'll continue to do that here today. My definition as it stands reads that a dystopia is an imaginary place or condition which is bad in a way which is not hellish, natural, traditional or chaotic, opposed to authoritarian, nostalgic, bordered utopias, while still being oriented towards a utopian horizon. In dystopias, space is controlled through enclosure, standardization, regimentation, and surveillance, much like in a prison. Time is controlled through restriction, division, monopolization, and exploitation, much like in a workplace. And so I'm going to be adding to my previous discussions of the control of space, so control of the physical world that we spend our time in, the control of time, how we spend our days, to thinking more broadly about the control of reproduction, which is really the control of generational time. So how do we extend, if we're the designer of this dystopian society, right? How do we extend the control of the spaces we live in and the present moment out across decades, across generations? And really how you do this is you try and create better dystopian subjects. You create more people and you make those people better suited to living in your dystopia. So this leads us on to the question of how can you control reproduction? How can you create these new, better dystopian subjects? And the first way that I want to talk about is education. This is kind of the first step. You take the subjects you already have, who might be slightly unruly, maybe all different from one another, and you train them, you educate them into being better subjects. So we can see this method of control really explicitly addressed in What Not, in a scene where Kitty had gone home for the weekend from her work at the Ministry of Brains to the village of Little Chantry, where her brother lived. So this is a scene where they're walking through the village. They were passing the little town hall that stood in the village marketplace. Its face was plastered with an immense poster. This was a new Ministry of Brains poster, new this week. It read in large type, "Improve your brains. Go in for the government course of mind training. It will benefit you, it will benefit your country, it will benefit posterity. Old age must come, but it need not be a doddering old age. Lay up good mental capacities to meet it, and make it a fruitful and happy time. See what the mind training course has done for others, and let it do the same for you." Then in smaller type, "Here are a few reports from those who have benefited from it. From a famous financier. Since I began the course, I have doubled my income and halved those of 750 others. I hope, by the time I have completed the course, to have ruined twice this number. From a cabinet minister, owing to the mind training course, I have now remained in office for over 6 weeks. I hope to remain for at least 3 more. From an inveterate writer of letters to newspapers, I no longer do this. Then, in large type again, all this has happened to others. Why should it not happen to you? Save yourself, save your country, save the world. So this is obviously Macaulay being satirical about this kind of government propaganda. She's looking at this mind training course poster and she's saying, isn't it silly? Because what does making someone better actually mean? For a financier, this might just mean that they are better at ripping other people off, right? For a cabinet minister, it might mean they're just slightly less ineffectual than we've come to expect. And for your average person, it might mean that they just stop doing the silly, trivial things that they used to do, like writing letters to newspapers, right? So she's partly just joking that this isn't really going to work very well or work in the way that the government has intended. But what she's also doing is really drawing attention to this idea that this education program is not really for you, the person taking it. It's not for the good of either the individual or the community. It's not saying, oh, education in itself is a good and it will help you to think more critically and imagine more clearly. Instead, it's saying you have to do this for posterity, so for future generations, and for your country, right? So this is part of a nationalist project, which I think is really important. And we can see this also kind of playing into the next method of reproductive control I want to talk about, which is containment. So one way of controlling reproduction is to make sure it only happens in designated spheres. And in this instance, that would be in the heterosexual, monogamous, married reproductive couple, the family unit, right? That's where reproduction is allowed to happen. That's where we can create more people. So part of containing reproduction is about painting any reproduction outside of that sphere as deviant. We see this in another trip back to Little Chantry's. Kitty is this time accompanied by two other government explainers who've been sent to explain the plans of the Ministry of Brains to the villagers. And one of these is Mr. Dixon, who's a clergyman who's just been giving a talk in town. The end house, which is where Kitty's brother lives, with his girlfriend, who they have a baby, he has a baby with, even though they are unmarried. The end house had offered its hospitality to all the three explainers, and they were spending the night there instead of, as usual, at the village inn. Pansy said with her sweet, ingratiating smile, "I was saying to Kitty, Mr. Dixon, that you made me feel quite bad with your talk about free love, that is, love outside marriage." "I'm sorry," said Dixon, "but it was the vicar who talked of that, not I. I talked of organised love. I never talk of free love. I don't like it." "I notice you didn't," said Pansy. "That's just what I felt so bad about. Mind you, I think you're awfully right, only it takes so much living up to, doesn't it, with things tangled up as they are. Sure you don't mind staying with us, I suppose?" she asked innocently, rolling at him a sidelong glance from her beautiful music hall eyes. Dixon looked at sea. "Mind? Well, you might, mightn't you? As ours is free." So Kitty and Pansy then explain that Pansy and Kitty's brother have had this baby out of wedlock. And Pansy is also a music hall dancer, so she's kind of painted as this outsider in that way as well, from this kind of society. But she goes on and she says, "I do hope," Pansy added to both her guests, slipping on her courteous and queenly manner, "that you will allow it to make no difference." Dixon stopped and, looking at his hostess squarely in the face, they were exactly of a height, said, "I am sorry, but I'm afraid it does make a difference. I hate being rude, and I am most grateful to you for your hospitable invitation, but I must go to the inn instead." Pansy stared back, and a slow and lovely rose colour overspread her clear face. So we can see here that even we don't have direct government control of reproduction here. There are no government enforcers that we can see. There's no police, right? There's no threat of violence. But there's still this attitude of public shaming and social ostracization. So Dixon will now not associate with Pansy and her little baby. He's painting her as kind of dangerous and outside the social order because she has this uncontained reproduction. And we can see how this particularly hits women. So, as I said, Pansy is a music hall dancer, but often licentious reproduction is associated with racialized women, with lower class women, and with sex workers. You can see that in this World War II warning to soldiers for associating with women who might give them sexually transmitted diseases. So the face of uncontained reproduction is often the face of the woman in the red dress, whose face is death. But Macaulay really gives the last word to Pansy here. She's kind of sympathetic to Pansy, I think. And Pansy says back to Dixon, "I'd a long sight rather have to explain free love than love by act of parliament." So we see this little rebellion here. Now, the next form of reproductive control I wanted to talk about is incentivization. So that's the idea of giving incentives, giving rewards to people when they do the kind of reproduction that you want them to do. Basically, it's not enough to contain reproduction into families, into marriages, because within this system of reproductive control, you want some families to have more children than others, right? There's a particular vision that you're trying to create of what the good dystopian subject looks like, which in this case is sold as the intelligent subject. And this is discussed in explicitly utopian terms in a meeting that Kitty Fremont has with Nikki Chester, who is the Minister for Brains himself. He's giving her a briefing before she goes off to be an explainer, and he says, "You must let the people in. Don't keep them at official arm's length. Let them feel part of it all. Make them catch fire with the idea of it, its sheer stark truth. Intelligence is the thing that counts, if only everyone would see it. They must want it so much that they'll even sacrifice a little of their personal comfort and desires to get it for themselves and their children. They must want it more than money, more than comfort, more than love, more than freedom. You'll have to get hold of different people in different ways, of course, but first, always try to collar their imaginations." So here we can see this really positive image of what the world will be like if people are more intelligent. This great dream that is better than love and comfort and money and, importantly, freedom. So this is part of this incentivization, right? Is showing people the world that you want, but there's also really literal rewards that are given out by the Ministry of Brain. So if you have a marriage and have babies that the ministry think will be intelligent after assessing you and your partner, they think your genetics will produce intelligent babies, you get a literal financial reward from the government. So this is very literally using incentives to control reproduction. And that really brings us to the real life dystopia that I wanted to talk about. Because when you're deciding who are the couples you want to have children and who are the couples you don't want to have children, what you're really tapping into is the history of eugenics. So eugenics was a movement founded in the 19th century by Charles Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton. And it's based on the belief that we should be actively intervening in human evolution to try and create better people. We should try and breed better people, essentially. And this movement has had a long and very racist and ableist history. This idea of who are the better people that you want has always been raised and always been based on ability. And in order to talk about it more fully, I want to draw on the work of Asha Nadkarni, and specifically her book, Eugenic Feminism, Reproductive Nationalism in the United States and India. So what Nadkarni does really well is demonstrate that eugenics can kind of be found in all of these different forms of political thought. It's not just in people who would go out and say, "I'm a eugenicist," because often, as she points out, after World War II and after the Nazis had so publicly embraced eugenics in their dream of creating an Aryan nation, people after that didn't want to ally themselves with eugenics because it was kind of tainted by this Nazi legacy. But the ideas behind eugenics, the ideas that you can breed better people, really lived on in a lot of different forms of politics. And Nadkarni focuses on US and Indian feminisms as a place where we can see eugenics. So I'll be making another video going into her ideas in more detail, which are really worth spending some time with. But for now, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of some of the forms of eugenics that she talks about and how we can apply them to dystopias. So she opens her book with a discussion of Margaret Sanger, who was an early birth control advocate and American feminist, and her visit to India. So Nadkarni writes, speaking in a 1935 radio broadcast in Bombay titled "What Birth Control Can Do for India," American birth control pioneer Margaret Sanger outlined the importance of reproductive control to the incipient Indian nation. Sanger proposed that India's first consideration must be the primary one of what kind of people you're going to have in the future. You need, as never before, the finest men and women possible. the strongest spiritually, intellectually, and physically. This means you must give consideration to what kind of children you are now bringing into the world to take up the responsibilities of your nation in the future. So we can see here really similar rhetoric to that Nikki Chester is using. A utopian dream of this amazing Indian nation that's going to be full of strong people, people who are strong in every way. So this is very much the control of reproduction, a good reproduction, right? You're just encouraging people to do the good kind of reproduction to make better and better people. This follows the incentivization model that we've already seen. But what Nadkarni makes clear is that this incentivization model is never the only one that's being used by eugenicists. There's never only the dream of the good world when better people have been created. So as she writes here, this is Sanger's explicit aims in visiting India, as described in a letter to eugenicist C.P. Blacker, were, quote, first to bring the poorer and biologically worse endowed stocks the knowledge of birth control that is already prevalent among those who are both genetically and economically better favoured, and secondly, to bring the birth rates of the East more in line with those of the civilizations of the West. So here we have a really different picture of reproductive control. Well, what you're doing is not trying to create better people, but to prevent the birth of worse people, right? The poorer and so-called biologically worse endowed stocks. And this is really at the heart of eugenics, is that you're never just trying to create better people. You're always also trying to stop worse people being born. And what Nadkarni shows is that this isn't just a question of rhetoric. This isn't just how people are talking about the supposedly biologically worse endowed poor people. Rather, this was directly implemented in Indian population control policies. So she writes, government officials introduced the use of incentives and disincentives and target-oriented sterilization camps. The use of such coercive methods reached its apex during the state of emergency declared by Indira Gandhi in 1975 when, as historian Michael Latham quotes an Indian analyst as saying, even the facade of voluntarism was ripped off. This involved the denial of public food rations to families with more than 3 children, the delivery of irrigation water at subsidised rates only to villages that met sterilisation quotas, and legislation requiring that teachers be sterilised or forfeit a month's pay. Although, as Matthew Connolly notes, at no point did anyone state as a matter of policy that poor people would starve if they did not accept IUDs or sterilisation, that was all too often the upshot of such policies on both the national and international levels, right? So we can see here that these eugenic ideas are being directly put into practice, and that birth control, far from giving people more reproductive freedoms and the abilities to reproduce in the way that they wish to, instead it's being used as a method of penalising and controlling the population, trying to make fewer of some people exist in the world. Nadkarni sums this up when she talks about positive and negative eugenics. She says, if positive eugenics emphasise better breeding to make the, quote, finest men and women possible, in Sanger's phrase, then negative eugenics is concerned with controlling the reproduction of those deemed unfit. At its heart, then, eugenics is both utopian and violent. Utopian in that it looks forward to a future in which disease, disability, and conflict arising from racial differences are a thing of the past. Violent in that achieving such a future requires the excision of all those deemed unfit. And this was Margaret Sanger's famous phrase, is more from the fit, less from the unfit. So I think we can see, interestingly, this idea of utopia. Maybe this is the utopia that dystopias are critiquing, the eugenic utopia. And maybe the violence that Nadkarni is talking about here is a kind of dystopian violence. That's something to think about. Certainly, what we can see, turning back to Whatnot and dystopias, is that Nadkarni is really clearly leading out the real life kinds of eugenic population control policies that we see in dystopias, focused on not on incentivization this time, but deterrence. So, trying to stop people from reproducing who you consider to be undesirable. In whatnot, the people who are being deterred from reproducing are explicitly disabled people. So if we turn back to this utopian speech that Nicky Chester was given, we can see a section that I cut out of it previously, where he's saying, we should make them catch fire with the idea of intelligence as the thing that counts. He adds, we should make them see stupidity for the limp, hopeless, helpless animal thing it is, an idiot drivelling on a green. He means an intellectually disabled person. Kitty could have fancied that he shuddered a little. Make them hate it, want the other thing, want it so much they'll even sacrifice, etc., etc. So we can see here is start of this fear and hatred that this politics is rooted in, and we get a much clearer picture of this in a later scene where Nicky Chester and Kitty have gone to Italy and they're having dinner. So Macaulay writes, one evening while they sat there, a half-witted contadino, an Italian peasant, slouched out of the chapel and begged from them. Chester refused sharply and turned his face away. The imbecile hung about, mouthed a confused prayer, bowing and crossing before the shrine, got no help from that quarter either, and at last shambled disconsolately down the hillside, crooning an unintelligible song to himself. Kitty, looking at Chester, saw with surprise that his face was rigid with disgust. He looked as if he were trying not to shudder. How you hate them, Nicky, she said curiously. He said, I do. I had a twin sister like that, and a brother not very far removed from it. I remember even consulting Maggie as to whether it wouldn't be a good thing to take them out into a wood and lose them, like the babes in the wood. Then, as I grew older, I became angry with my parents, who had no right, of course, to have had any children at all. They were first cousins and deficiency was in the family. It was that first set me thinking about the whole subject. So we can see here that this utopian vision we've been giving of the better world with cleverer people, and the very intellectually high-minded project of creating world peace by promoting intelligence and education, is actually at its basis based on this kind of visceral gut hatred, this shuddering and shaking and revulsion and turning away from disabled people. We can see this kind of horror, the idea that someone would need care, would require care, and that actually this dream that everyone should be totally independent from everyone else, and that's really what the great future of humanity is not depending on one another at all. So, Nicky Chester sees this person who is begging and doesn't think, look at how society has failed to provide this person with any other means of providing for themselves. Look at the lack of care here, how terrible. Instead, he just thinks how terrible that this person exists at all and wants to wipe them out of existence. So this great utopian project of making people more intelligent for world peace is actually the hatred of a man for his brother and sister, who he plans to kill, to leave in the woods and abandon to their deaths, despite the fact that they have parents and another sibling to care for them, and who are always presented as happy to care for them. So it's this kind of murderous intent which is driving the deterrence policies adopted by the Ministry of Defence, which involves fining people, taxing them very terribly if they have children in kind of non-government approved couples. So if people who aren't considered to be intelligent enough have children, they are fined. And they are fined so ruinously that often they will abandon the children, abandon the babies, to die outside because they can't afford to keep them. So we can see the literal murderousness of this kind of reproductive control. So this brings us back, for the last time, at least for now, to my definition of dystopia. And this is what I've added to it, is the idea that reproduction is controlled through education, containment, incentivization, and deterrence, much like in eugenic programs. So this is the kind of reproductive controls that we can see in dystopia, which I think make dystopian societies what they are. I always like to end on a hopeful note, a hope that looks to the future and looks to the people who are in real life actively struggling against these kind of reproductive controls. And I think we can really see that in the field of disability justice. So, disability justice is quite a young field or movement or way of thinking. And some of the founders of disability justice operate in the collective, the activist and performance collective Sin's Invalid, who have written this disability justice primer, Skin, Tooth and Bone, the basis of movement is our people. So I just wanted to finish on some words from them, which are centered around a politics which is founded on the rights and dignity of disabled people, and an end to all attempts to curtail their bodily autonomy, which very much includes reproductive control. So, in this primer, Sin's Invalid write, "We are enraged by the recent abortion bans that are targeting people's ability to make safe and autonomous reproductive choices throughout the US. The violent control and oppression of people's bodies in the US did not begin with this legislation. We have seen this through the infliction of boarding, retraining schools on Indigenous people. We have witnessed state-sponsored eugenic programs in 32 states and Puerto Rico. Historical attempts to control deviant bodies show that reproductive choices must be understood as a human rights issue. Access to information, quality healthcare, and autonomy in decision-making are essential to the well-being of all. Choosing when to become a parent is a basic principle of reproductive justice. On one hand, the fear of disability has been used as a tool to manipulate individuals' reproductive choices, sometimes causing people to opt for selective abortions to avoid disability, which is in line with eugenics. Meanwhile, because of the isolation of ableism, people with disabilities will be less likely to find safe options to terminate pregnancies when they choose. This context means these abortion bans will be catastrophic for disabled folks. Disability justice holds a vision born out of collective struggle. Within 1,000 underground paths, we ignite small, persistent fires of rebellion in everyday life. Disabled people of the global majority, black and brown people, share common ground, confronting and subverting colonial powers in our struggle for life and justice. There has always been resistance to all forms of oppression, as we know in our bones that there have always also been disabled people visioning a world where we flourish, a world that values and celebrates us in all our beauty." So those are my thoughts on the control of reproduction in dystopian thinking and how we can fight against it. As I mentioned, I'll be making another video going into more detail into Asha Nadkarni's Eugenic Feminism, and there are more learning resources on my website at katiemcgregorstone.co.uk. But for now, thank you and you're welcome.